Hello, so welcome to part 21 of toxin sequestration theory. This is my new theory of cancer. I'm very excited about it because it gives a completely different take on why the body has cancer tumors. I'm saying that the body actually builds them on purpose for a reason to sequester and store toxins. And we've gone through a long list of toxins that cancer tends to sequester, store, or process. We've talked about glucose, fructose. We've talked about ammonia, microplastics, heavy metals, mycotoxins. We've talked about cigarette smoke and ethanol and also estrogen. We've talked about all the toxic metals, non-heme iron and copper, nickel, etc. And today I'm going to get right to it, but we're going to add two new toxins to the list. I'm going to talk about asbestos and aluminum. And let's start with asbestos. Now, nowadays people don't really talk about asbestos that much, but it was a huge deal in the 1900s. And that's because it was a key cause of a type of cancer called mesothelioma. And so let's look at the history of asbestos. So basically, in the 1940s, it became really popular because of massive wartime construction use. So it was used very popularly in construction in the 1940s. And then it peaked basically in the 1950s and 1960s. People were using a lot of asbestos back then. And then finally in the 60s and 70s, they recognized the health consequences of asbestos. And then regulations started to come in like the 1980s. That's whenever bans started happening in countries where they started to ban asbestos. So what actually is asbestos? It's a silicate, so it's like kind of like a mineral or a crystal, and it has a fibrous structure, and it's sharp, like has a needle-like structure, and they're very durable and very sharp. And then when you breathe them in, they get lodged inside your lungs, and they're really hard for the body to eliminate. And like I said, they're basically in insulation, brakes, roofing, and building materials. So that's where they were found in the past. But yeah, so like I said, once you inhale them, they were too long and too sharp for the lungs to really clear them. Like normally the lungs would clear things with either macrophages or with mucus, the so-called mucociliary escalator. But apparently those don't work really well with asbestos. And sure enough, it fits perfectly in my theory. It is a toxin. It does create oxidative stress. It produces reactive oxygen species, particularly the hydroxyl radicals. So it fits in perfectly with every other toxin that I've covered in my series. And what's really interesting is how the body responds in a tiered way. It doesn't just jump straight to mesothelioma. First, what it does is it tries to just sequester and contain and sort of neutralize this asbestos toxin, which imagine these little sharp fibers in your lungs. It neutralizes them by coating them with iron and protein. So it actually uses iron and protein to kind of coat it, to basically make it less toxic. And that is what's called an asbestos body. So an asbestos body is a mini vault. So remember in my series, I've been talking about mini vaults a lot. I've been talking about, the skin tags, the cherry angiomas, the lipomas, the pimples, the cysts. And those are all mini vaults where the body, manages to kind of locally sequester a toxin so that it doesn't cause like systemic damage. And an asbestos body, which is basically a fiber that's been coated intentionally by the body with iron and protein, is a way for the body to kind of neutralize that toxin in a little mini vault. That goes so far, of course, but eventually maybe it's not enough, and maybe you're just getting all these asbestos fibers everywhere, and eventually the body can escalate to the next strategy, the next tier above, right? Because tier one is basically things like mucus, Tier 2 is the mini vaults, and then Tier 3 are the cancer tumors. So then it can escalate to a tumor to then sequester and store the asbestos whenever basically the mini vaults aren't enough. And so, by the way, I want to emphasize that whenever I introduce a toxin in my theory, it's always backed up by the medical literature that the toxin is preferentially sequestered or stored or processed by cancer cells. Every single toxin that I've talked about has medical research backing it up. And sure enough, asbestos is another example of that. So studies have shown consistently that asbestos fibers are present in dramatically higher concentrations inside of cancer tissue, cancer tumors in mesothelioma. So in this particular lung cancer called mesothelioma, they've analyzed how much asbestos is inside of it versus how much asbestos is in the normal healthy tissue. So they can compare them side by side. And they find there's much higher asbestos in the mesothelioma cancer cells than in the normal healthy lung tissue. This is in the medical literature. So this directly supports TST. And I want, for those people who want real hard evidence, this is hard evidence saying that cancer tumors, in particular in mesothelioma, the cancer cells concentrate the asbestos relative to the normal healthy lung tissue. In fact, they've found sometimes up to 20-fold higher times concentration in asbestos of asbestos in the actual cancer cells relative to 20 times higher, more asbestos in the cancer tumor than in the lung tissue. So that's saying that the cancer cells are trying to sequester the asbestos. And sure enough, once they're inside, they're basically stored in lipid droplets. So, and it's well known, I've talked to you guys before about how the cancer cells have these lipid droplets. They're useful for storing seed oils, for storing forever chemicals, for storing some toxic metals. And in this case, the asbestos fibers become physically trapped within this lipid sort of architecture. But also, in addition, there's one more point, which is that these mesothelioma tumors have a dense collagen-rich fibrous stroma that acts like a biological fortress. And it's kind of like a thick scar-like collagen meshwork that literally grows around and encases these asbestos fibers. So it physically immobilizes them. Because as you can imagine, you don't want these fibers just kind of like jiggling around and getting out. You have to like contain it. So there's this collagen-rich structure that physically basically wraps around these asbestos fibers that immobilizes them. And then that stroma is inside the tumor, right? So basically that helps the tumor physically isolate the asbestos. And so it sort of turns the tumor into like a reinforced containment chamber. Okay, so that's basically the idea, with asbestos. And I recognize that really nowadays people don't worry about asbestos as much. It's not the most important toxin nowadays, but it was really important in the 1900s because it was a massive problem back then. And it was the direct link to this mesothelioma cancer. And we can understand mesothelioma as the body's intelligent attempt to store and sequester and contain these toxic asbestos fibers inside the tumor tissue in the lungs. Okay, so let's move on to the next toxin, which is aluminum. Now, aluminum is really interesting, and it is relevant in the modern day. It's very relevant in the modern day, and it's especially relevant to today's children because, as you know, aluminum is part of the childhood vaccine schedule. It is inside of childhood vaccines, and it's a very important toxin. It's extremely important because it's a well-known neurotoxin. It's been connected to Alzheimer's and it's been connected to autism, and it has no known biological role in the body. So it literally serves no beneficial purpose. We don't. It's not like something like magnesium or calcium or potassium where it actually serves some use. It literally has no known biological purpose in the body, so it's purely a toxin. And sure enough, its production in the world has gone up dramatically over the past century. You can look at a plot, basically from in the year 1900, there was basically like no aluminum production. But then in the mid 1900s, then in the late 1900s, it just skyrocketed. So in the past, basically 120 years, the production of aluminum has essentially just monotonically increased, just gone up and up and up. And so it's a toxin that our ancestors did not have to deal with. They did not have to deal with aluminum. It is a new toxin. And that's why I try to tell people, like, look, if you want to blame, chronic disease on germs, like that doesn't make any sense because germs have stayed constant, over time. But aluminum, for example, has skyrocketed. Our ancestors did not have to deal with aluminum. But in any case, or at least they didn't have to deal with it nearly as much as we did. I mean, of course, there's some aluminum in the plants that if people ate plants, but they didn't have to deal with it at the industrial level, and they certainly didn't have to deal with it in vaccines. Okay, so what I will talk to you about with respect to aluminum is the body's tiered strategy once again for dealing with aluminum. So it turns out that at the bottom of the tier, when the body gets exposed to aluminum, it often stores it in the liver and the fat tissue. And then the next level up is that it can store it in the bones and the joints. And then it can store aluminum in the lymph nodes as well as lung nodules. Lung nodules are also fit into my theory of TST as sort of very similar to cancer tumors, basically toxin storage vaults. And then finally, beyond that, it can escalate to storing aluminum in cancer tumors. So that's kind of the tiered response that the body gives to aluminum. And just to remind you, what are the exposures to aluminum that people typically have? Well, there's the antiperspirants. It's a key ingredient in many antiperspirants. So obviously, if you do use an antiperspirant, like you have to watch out for this. This is very important. And stop using antiperspirants, especially ones that have aluminum in them. And we'll get into the fact that basically the breast cancer has been linked to aluminum, and what people believe there is going on is that because the underarm is very close to the breast tissue, it could be from the antiperspirants actually. That it could be the antiperspirant-based aluminum that's driving breast cancer. And then there's the aluminum that's in cookware or packaging or foods. And if you're a carnivore, there's more good news for you because the foods that are highest in the aluminum are tea, chocolate, spices and herbs, baked goods, cereal foods, spinach and mushrooms, and dried fruits and candies. So none of those are carnivore foods. Those are all sort of plant-based or standard American diet stuff. So all of those foods would be eliminated on a carnivore diet. So this is more reason to consider that animal-based eating is a very good approach to reducing your exposure to toxic metals, not just aluminum, but other toxic metals as well. But isn't it interesting, right? Like this helps us get more insight. Like, oh, now we start to understand why the carnivore diet is working so well. It dramatically reduces your exposure to toxic metals. And then finally, there's the vaccines, okay? And some people are afraid to talk about this, but, not on this channel. We'll talk about anything. And so it is well known that aluminum is in the DTaP or Tdap vaccines, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, the hepatitis A vaccine, the HPV vaccine, as well as the Hib vaccine and the hepatitis V vaccine. So there are multiple vaccines that have aluminum in them. They use aluminum to elicit an immune response. And basically, it looks like a child following the standard vaccine schedule will receive roughly 4 milligrams of aluminum from vaccines in the first 6 months of life. And that's a very small baby, so it could be, a big load of aluminum for that baby to handle. But the more important issue is that the injection bypasses the GI tract, right? It goes in the GI tract has its natural barriers. So this is bad, basically. Like, in other words, injecting someone with aluminum is much worse than giving it to them orally, because the GI tract has barriers to some barriers to aluminum. But if you inject it into someone, it directly bypasses those barriers. So it's more toxic to inject it than to just orally take it. So, if you're sort of worried about vaccines, you have to worry about aluminum, right? You have to think carefully about this. And now, as I said, it is a well-known neurotoxin, and it has been linked to Alzheimer's disease. Aluminum has been found in higher concentrations in the brains of individuals with Alzheimer's. And it's associated with some of the key pathologies in Alzheimer's called neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques. So those are some of the things that people typically see in Alzheimer's, and apparently aluminum is connected to those. It is a toxin and it promotes oxidative stress, and I'll get into that in a second. But I also want to mention that it's connected to autism as well. So elevated aluminum levels have been documented in the brains of people with autism. So that, let me repeat that again. They have found elevated aluminum in people with autism. So it shows that the aluminum can accumulate, inside the cells in autistic brains. It says often at some of the highest levels recorded in human brain tissue. Okay, so just be aware. Aluminum is connected to both Alzheimer's and autism. It is a neurotoxin, and so how is it actually a toxin? Well, it turns out that its toxicity is somewhat indirect. It involves, many of us have iron overload, which is overload from non-heme iron because our foods were fortified with iron and people ate plant-based. Aluminum, whenever you have iron overload, it makes aluminum's toxicity worse because basically aluminum helps iron to generate reactive oxygen species. So it keeps iron in the right form so that iron can go off and cause trouble and generate oxidative stress. So in that sense, aluminum, you can potentially reduce the toxicity of aluminum by reducing your iron overload, reducing your non-heme iron overload. So that's one thing. But aluminum also has other mechanisms by which it's toxic as well. It does displace key minerals that things like magnesium and zinc. So obviously magnesium and zinc are super important minerals, and aluminum can kick those guys out. So it can basically displace magnesium and zinc, and that causes all sorts of trouble as well. But and there's other mechanisms by which aluminum generates oxidative stress. It disrupts the mitochondria. But it fits. It has multiple pathways by which it generates problems in the body. So let's get into now the tiered response to aluminum. So what does the body do in response? Well, the first tier one, of course, is just the usual detox where the liver and the kidneys and the fat tissue, their job is to handle aluminum. Sometimes the aluminum will end up stored in fat tissue. But basically that's tier one. And then when that gets overwhelmed, the body can use these mini vaults that I mentioned. So it can make aluminum deposits in the lymph nodes, as well as granulomas. It can deposit the aluminum in the bones, in the joints. And it can also deposit them in the lungs, in these lung nodules that I mentioned, especially from inhaled aluminum. Anyway, so hopefully that gives some insight into the mini vaults. And then now tier 3, we go to the full tumor vaults. This is the last resort, But when aluminum combines with other toxins in your diet, seed oils, copper, iron, etc., then the body may have to escalate all the way to these tumor vaults. And we can talk about where does aluminum tend to create tumors, like what parts of the body. And as you can imagine, there's the brain, because I already talked about how aluminum is a neurotoxin. So if aluminum does get into the brain, then the brain, the body has two options. Basically, you can allow the aluminum to damage the brain tissue, or you can make a tumor in the brain to sequester the aluminum. So as you can imagine, aluminum has been connected to brain tumors. It can cross the blood-brain barrier, especially if the blood-brain barrier is damaged. And then the second one I mentioned is breast tissue, so breast cancer. And I already talked about that. This is one of the most well-documented sites for aluminum accumulation in the breast. And many studies have found significantly higher aluminum levels in breast tumor tissue compared to normal breast tissue. Okay, and so this is once again actual real evidence supporting TST, saying that there's been medical research analyzing breast tissue, and they found higher concentrations of aluminum inside breast cancer tissue relative to normal breast tissue. That is saying that it's getting stored in the breast tumors. It's getting stored in the tumors, right? So the aluminum is getting stored in the tumor tissue. And then similarly, lungs, so inhaled aluminum from industrial exposure or from antiperspirants can lead to lung nodules as well as lung cancer itself. And then similarly, you could also get cancer in some other organs, things like the colon or the GI tract, from ingested aluminum, from food additives and cookware and packaging, etc. But yeah, and just to reiterate, there is actual real evidence in the medical literature with several independent analyses saying that there's higher aluminum concentrations in breast tumor tissue than in normal breast tissue. And similarly, there's been similar studies for colorectal cancer and lung cancer. So they found the exact same pattern in lung cancer and colorectal cancer. They found, for example, higher aluminum levels detected in lung tumor tissue compared to normal lung tissue. This is in the medical literature, so directly supporting TST. Okay, so that's the basic idea of aluminum and how it drives cancer, and how the medical research is supporting our theory, TST. It's saying that aluminum is found in higher concentrations in the tumor tissue, and sure enough, you can reduce your. So how do you actually deal with aluminum, like in your life, in your daily life? Obviously, if you have a child, or if you're thinking about if you're thinking about vaccines, you have to look at the risks, the pros and cons of the aluminum exposure in the vaccines. Also, if you're thinking about aluminum in your diet, I've already talked about how the plant-based foods have typically higher aluminum than the animal-based foods, roughly speaking. So if you're going more animal-based, you're going to reduce your aluminum exposure. And then there's also aluminum exposure from, the only one exception, by the way, is something called, basically, so processed cheeses can contain emulsifiers, because they add, that's just like an additive that they add in industrially, and those emulsifiers can have aluminum. So just, if you're eating cheese, just make sure that it's not like processed cheese, because they can add in additives like emulsifiers that have aluminum. And then obviously, if you have aluminum foil in your kitchen, throw that out. If you have aluminum containers for like storage, for food storage, then throw those out as well. Like, get rid of all the aluminum out of your kitchen. Of course, you can do testing, by the way. So there's hair tissue mineral analysis, HTMA. If you're worried about, do I have aluminum toxicity, or do I have toxicity of other metals, do an HTMA. I highly recommend it. You can work with an expert, and they can test your hair to see how much aluminum you have, as well as other toxic metals. And you can actually do this over time. You can do this test, once every several months, and just to see if things are getting better or worse. So there are ways to test for aluminum in your body. Yeah, all right. So just to sum up, in this video we've talked about two new toxins, asbestos and aluminum. In both cases, the body has a tiered response, a hierarchical response, where it has its first primary levels of trying to get rid of these guys, and then it has its mini vaults, and then it has the tumors. And in both cases, both asbestos and aluminum, there is real medical literature showing that they are found in higher concentrations inside of cancer tumors than in normal tissue. They give us direct evidence supporting our theory, TST. All right, thanks everyone for listening. Have a great day.